Welcome to an SFB Addict video. What is Starfleet Battles? Well, here's the incredibly short explanation. It is the maneuvering of counters around on a map to represent starships. You fire weapons at each other. You damage the shields until you actually punch through the shields, and then you start damaging the internal boxes on the ship until you run out of internal boxes, and then the ship blows up, kind of thing. That is, in essence, Starfleet Battles. So there you go, how to play Starfleet Battles in 30 seconds. That actually doesn't tell you how to play. That basically gives you a representation of what the game is. So I will now go into about a 45-minute explanation, breaking it down in depth on a shallow level and play Starfleet Battles. By shallow, I mean I'm not going to give you in-depth mechanics of how every single rules, tactical implications of those mechanics, and the strategies you can use to employ those mechanics to achieve victory. SFB Addict here, we are going to remake the Part 4 video with the updated client. So this is the quick learn how to play Starfleet Battles. Now it is not going to be as in-depth as the other videos I have on learning to play through scenario 1, 2, 3, 4. This is just going to be a quick and dirty explanation of Starfleet Battles and the basic mechanics of it. So if you want to view any of the other learn to plays, just go to the playlists on my YouTube page and the other videos are there. Okay, so let's open up the client, and we'll just do this as a game offline. And here we have the map. Okay, so we're just basically going to go over the basic concepts, starting with the allocation of power, moving the counters, maneuvering, shooting, marking damage. First thing we'll do is we will grab a counter. Now you'll notice that this is a hex grid game, and most games abstract real 3D space to a 2D game board. So if we look at the Starship data sheets for this game, and let me just pull up Federation here for a Federation cadet cruiser, you'll notice that there are 6 shields which go along with and match up with the 6 hex sides of a hex. So your number 1 shield on this counter is this line right here between this line and this line. And let me mark it here. So this is your number 1 shield, this is your number 2 shield, this is your number 6 shield. And these lines that are in between demark the boundaries of your shields. And of course, when you move and turn your ship, your number 1 shield is always still pointing directly forward of the ship, so this is now where the number 1 shield is. Now, the primary way this game is played is you fill out an energy allocation form, which is basically a spreadsheet. So every turn is a set amount of time. So you can think of this as 30 seconds, 3 minutes, 3 hours, whatever you want, whatever is most comfortable with you to visualize or conceptualize the game as. But basically, every set amount of time you reallocate where your energy is going. Now you can make minute changes in energy during a turn using your batteries. But the turn breaks is basically the cycle where you reallocate where your energy is going. And your weapons recharge in accordance with that cycle. So on turn 1, if your weapon, your phaser for instance, is armed and you fire it on turn 1, the energy allocation end of turn break is where that weapon is then recharged, and then in turn 2 you can then fire it again. And the energy allocation turn break between turn 2 and turn 3 is where the weapon is recharged again, and in turn 3 you can fire it again. Now there are some game kludges to try and keep things in line with that. For instance, you do have batteries, so if you fire your phaser on turn 1, why can't you drain a battery to recharge the phaser and fire it again? Well, theoretically you should be able to do that, but it's just one of the rules of the game that your weapons can only fire once per turn, so that's why you can't do that. This particular cadet cruiser, for instance, has 2 batteries located here on the SSD. So if we didn't have that rule, you could theoretically fire 3 of your phaser 1s and then drain 2 battery and then fire phaser 1s again. But this would make batteries a very, very important system for your weapons, and they weren't really meant to be that. Not only that, but then you would have to create a whole new set of rules on how your weapons can overheat, because, well, just take a regular rifle, for instance. If you fire a rifle over and over again, the barrel heats up. It softens the metal. It can actually end up damaging the weapon if it's not allowed to cool. So you would then have to try and create rules like that for the game, and they just decided not to go that route. Anyway, when you fill out your energy allocation form, basically you need to know what energy you have. So your warp, impulse, and atomic power reactors are how you generate power, and they total together to give you a total. So on this particular SSD, we have 8 left warp, 8 right warp, 2 impulse, and then 2 atomic power reactors. So that totals to 20 power. So again, that was left warp, right warp, impulse engine, APR. And then you have 2 batteries available. And then during the turn, you get to allocate where that power is going. Now the spreadsheets in Vassal don't let you widen your column widths individually, so I have to make the entire thing wider to get the full text. But anyway, so each weapon has its own arming costs, and that's rules in the game you can go into in detail later. But for instance, here we're holding 2 photon torpedoes, or arming them, and then you've got a line for movement. If you're not actually moving to speed but simply sitting still on a hex, you can do things called tactical maneuverings. And then you have your shield lines, where you can add more power to your shield to reinforce that shield, and that actually dissipates every turn, kind of thing. And then you have lines for how you wish to arm your shuttles. Shuttles can do special missions. They can act as a seeking weapon distraction device, or they can basically have antimatter loaded on board of them, and they can actually be piloted and act sort of like a bomb. If they strike a target, they blow up, kind of thing. And then you have the standard Star Trek technology, where you have tractor beams and transporters. And then we have a couple lines here for electronic warfare, which aren't actually part of the cadet game, but they are part of the full game. And then you have ways of fixing your ship, the fixing of the shields, fixing of internal systems. And then your laboratories have scientific functions and functions in the game in terms of identifying seeking weapons. And then you add up everything that you've allocated and where you've allocated it, and you make sure you've spent the appropriate amount of power. And then we have some note-keeping lines here at the bottom of the energy allocation form. Each one of your phasers has power, a sort of like a battery bank for the weapon, which is called a capacitor. So we have 3 phaser 1s, and a phaser 1 takes 1 point of power to arm. And then you have 2 phaser 3s, and a phaser 3 takes half a point of power to arm, and you have 2 of them, so that's 1 point, and 4 points in total. So if during the turn 1 we were to, say, fire 2 phaser 1s, we would have drained 2 power from the phaser capacitor, meaning there would be 2 points left in the capacitor for use on turn 2, and if we wanted the other 2 phaser capacitors to be recharged, we would have to use the recharge phaser line and put 2 more points of power here, or maybe 1 or 1.5 points of power. So what's on the phaser recharge line and what's down below in your phaser capacitor line is the amount of power you have available for that turn to fire phasers. And then you got the same thing going on with your batteries. You have a battery available. If during the energy allocation of your turn you drain those batteries to use, you would drain it, and then your total power would be 22 because you've added 2 battery to the 20, and then you would allocate your systems. And on the second turn, if you wanted your batteries to be recharged kind of thing, you would have to recharge your batteries. Or if instead of draining your battery during energy allocation, let's say during the turn you drain it to reinforce a shield, you would mark down here that you've used your 2 batteries during the turn, which means the top of the next turn there would be 0 batteries of 2 available, and you would need to recharge them to make them available during the game. And that 2 would come out of your 20 total. So that's basically how your energy allocation form works. So every turn, every set sequence of time, you reallocate where your power is going. So this turn maybe you've gone speed 10, and maybe you've put 6 points of power into reinforcing your shield, and then you've paid for photon A and photon B, and that is 20 points of power. So you've used 20 kind of thing. And then next turn, you get to decide all over again where your power is going. So maybe you only arm 1 photon. Maybe you go speed 12. Maybe you go 4 points of reinforcement. And then maybe you're paying 1 point into a tractor beam and 1 point into a transporter. So you get to decide every set amount of time where your power goes. Now some weapons are every turn firing weapons. Some weapons are multi-turn arming weapons. And then there are other types of weapons which actually take even more turns to arm. So for instance, a disruptor or a phaser are every turn firing weapons. A photon torpedo is a 2-turn arming weapon, and then plasma torpedoes are 3-turn arming weapons. So let's say we were coming in with none of our photons armed. This would be turn 1 of arming, and this would be turn 2 of arming and ready to fire, because this is the second turn of arming and it's ready to be used. If it was a plasma torpedo, this would also be another turn of arming, and then this turn here, turn 3, would be the final turn of arming, and it would be available to be used during turn 3. So different weapons have different arming cycles. That's a little bit more in depth than I meant to go, but anyway. So that's how you allocate your power, and then you move your counter on the map. So let's get rid of the energy allocation form because we're pretty much done explaining what that is. So every ship has a movement cost. Most ships are a movement cost of 1, but you can, for instance, have a dreadnought, for instance, which is a 1.5 cost. So if I were to go speed 10, it would cost me 15 points of energy to go speed 10. And then we have smaller ships, like a destroyer, where it's a half point cost for movement. So to go speed 10, it only costs me 5 points of energy. This is a cadet cruiser, and its movement cost is 1. So it's 1 point of energy for 1 hex of movement. So if I were to put 10 points of power into movement, I get to move 10 hexes during the turn. Now how does that movement get conducted? Well, we use something called simultaneous movement, and that involves a movement chart. Now there's 3 different charts for this in the game. There is the cadet game, where it uses an 8 impulse chart, which is only used for a couple scenarios to get you used to the concept. And then everything else uses the 16 in cadet, that is. Everything else in cadet uses the 16 impulse chart. Now once you graduate from cadet, the game is played on a 32 impulse chart. So it's a very big chart. It has 32 impulses per turn. Whereas the cadet game, for the most part, uses a 16 impulse chart. But they operate exactly the same way. You call out your speed after you're done energy allocating. You mark off what speeds are being executed by the units, and then you go down through the impulses, and what is meant to move on that impulse gets called out and you move. So here, for instance, let me zoom in the map a little bit. wrong zoom. So when I call out impulse 1, the only thing that moves is speed 16. Now the units that I said are on the board moving are speed 12 and speed 6, so 6 and 12 don't move. Impulse 2, speed 6 doesn't, but speed 12's do. And then if I call impulse 3, speed 6 is due and speed 12 is due. So the slower units move first and the faster movements move after on the same impulse. And then you get the exact same thing happening with your 32 impulse chart, except there's more speed and there's more impulses. So in the cadet game, your maximum speed is speed 16. In the 32 impulse game, your maximum speed is speed 32. And it's the same thing. On impulse 1, only a speed 32 would move. On impulse 2, if we had a speed 30 and a speed 10 unit, speed 30 would move, speed 10 wouldn't. On impulse 3, 10 doesn't, 32 does. On impulse 4, speed 10 does, as does speed 30. And as we go down through the chart, you'll see that speed 30 moves pretty much on every impulse, except on impulse 17 it doesn't move, and on impulse 1 it doesn't move. So 1 and 17 it doesn't, and every other impulse it does. Speed 16 basically moves every second impulse. So 1 it doesn't, 2 it does, 3 it doesn't, 4 it does, and it goes that way for the entire turn. And you'll notice that everybody moves on the last impulse. So if you were doing speed 1, you would only move on impulse 32, and they didn't even bother to put 1 on the chart. 1 and 0 aren't on the chart because, well, everything moves on the last impulse, so if you're speed 1, you're going to not move the entire turn and only move on impulse 32. But if you're moving speed 2, you would move on the 16th impulse, and you would move on the last impulse. So that's basically how the movement chart is constructed. So every impulse of the game, everything moves simultaneously, and depending on this chart, will tell you whether or not you are going to move or not. So there's no rolling for initiative or anything like that. If you paid for your movement, you execute your movement according to the chart. Okay, so that brings up moving on the map. Well, every ship has a turn mode. So depending on what your speed is, it determines how often you can turn. So if I'm going on this particular ship, if I'm going between speed 1 and speed 6, my turn mode is 1, which means every time I move, I can turn. But if I'm going speed 7 to 16, my turn mode is 2. So if I were to turn, that is my, let me put on a marker here. So here, I just turned, which means the next time I move, I have to go forward, or side slip, I cannot turn. Now, that would be my second move, and then the next time I'm called on to move, that could be a turn. Now you notice that's a little bit rigid, and that's where things called side slips come in. So here I just turned, in 1102 I just turned. I've moved forward, that's one movement on that count of the turn mode. But let's say I don't want to go forward, and yet I'm not able to turn yet. Well, I can do something called a side slip. So instead of going to 1301, I can slip here over into 1302. And in effect, what that does is instead of going this direction forward, or turning and going this direction, it allows me to actually sort of go this direction. So halfway between here and here. That's what the side slipping does. So if I were to bring this counter down here, and if I rotate it, I'll turn off the trail. It might be a little bit easier to see down here. So this is at one hex row. That is straight ahead. So between straight ahead and out this hex row, there's a lot of space in between these two extremes. And a side slip basically lets you do movement in this direction. So if I were to go forward, side slip, go forward, side slip, you can see I'm heading in that rough direction. And I can mitigate that a little bit by going forward, side slipping, going forward, and side slipping. So it's sort of turning without turning. And that has implications on what shield is facing the enemy. So if I were to throw on this map here another counter, so here we have a Klingon and a Federation. And of course the Klingon ship would have its own SSD with its own shields. So here, if the Federation were to shoot at the Klingon, what is the range? Well, we do have a tool here in the client, and the range is 5. So the hex that we are in is counted as range 0. 1 hex away is range 1. And similarly. So if I'm counting from my ship to the enemy ship, my ship's hex is not counted, but the enemy ship's hex is counted. So that's range 5. And the weapons have a range. So across the top here, these numbers going across are a range. And then when you roll a die, there's a die roll here down the side, and you just intersect them. So at range 9 to 15, if I were to roll a 3, it would do 1 damage. But if I were to roll a 4, it would be 0 damage. At range 5, everything I roll is going to do damage, but if I roll a 1, it's going to do more damage than if I roll a 6. So it's the reverse of what most war games are. Rolling 1s are better than rolling 6s. Whereas most war games, if you roll a 6, is better than rolling a 1. But anyway, it's just a chart. It's based on the range you are away from your target, and then what you roll. So the die roll is the accuracy of your roll. And of course, you're going to be more accurate the closer you are. And you're going to be less accurate the farther away you are. So that's how all of the weapons charts work. And that's how you count the range. But again, when you're maneuvering around on the map, the question comes, well, what shield are you hitting? Well, here we're clearly number 1 shield facing number 1 shield. But if I were to move to this position, and the Federation ship was going to fire, what shield am I hitting? Because I'm hitting straight down the hex row in between the number 1 and the number 6 shield on the Klingon. Well, this comes down to moving. So that movement chart, we would look at that movement chart, and on the next impulse we would ask who's moving. Well, here it doesn't matter, because if the Fed were to move, I'd be hitting the Klingon number 6, and if the Klingon were to move, I'd be hitting the Klingon number 6. But what if it wasn't a head-on situation like that, but let's say instead this Fed was facing in that direction and firing? Well, here we would look at the chart, and if the Federation ship was moving next, then he would be firing from the position in front, and it would hit the number 1 shield, as you can see between that green divider on the hex pattern and this red line indicating where the line of fire would be. But if it were the Klingon that were to be moving next, then it would actually be hitting the number 6 shield, because it would be moving into 1103. So that's how you determine where the shield is being hit in this situation, which is called an ambiguous shield situation, because it's ambiguous until you look at where the ships are pointing and who moves on the next impulse. Now, there actually is a rule in the rule book that says you can pre-agree that whenever it's an ambiguous shield situation like that, that you can simply divide the energy between both shields. That's an option that you have to agree to before the game begins. And if you fail to make that agreement, then it comes down to looking at the next impulse to see who moves. And if you cannot agree to who's actually moving next, or for instance, if on the actual movement chart on the next impulse neither ship actually moves, then it comes down to defender's choice. So at that point, if it's the Federation firing, it's the Klingon that gets to decide if it's his number 1 or number 6 shield getting hit. So that's how maneuvering on the map can affect what shield gets hit. And that's probably the most complex thing about Starfleet battles, is that maneuvering. Now there is a little bit more structure to the game called the sequence of play. And we do actually have a graphic here for that. And it basically breaks down to these basic steps. You move your ships, and then you move seeking weapons, which are chasing the ships. If those seeking weapons hit the ships, you resolve any damage. Then it comes to the stage where you can launch new seeking weapons, or then you can then fire direct fire seeking weapons, and then you resolve any direct fire weapons damage. That's the end of the impulse, and then you call the next impulse to see who moves. Now this is the basic breakdown of it. It gets more complex. So here is the chart that you would use from scenario 7 onwards. So it's move ships, move seeking weapons, resolve seeking weapon damage. Romulans at this point are allowed to declare if they are cloaking or uncloaking. You can then activate tractor beams after that. Then comes the launching of seeking weapons. Then comes a stage to operate your shields and your transporters. Then comes a stage where you can recover or launch shuttlecraft. Then comes a stage where you can do direct fire, resolve the direct fire, and then end your impulse. And then as you add more rules, this is the more complex breakdown. So movement basically everybody considers to be one step. So everybody knows in what order everything moves during that, and they just simply move it. So if you're surrounded by a gas nebula, and that gas nebula is pushing and moving your ships, that would have effects on certain impulses. So terrain movement occurs first. Then if your ship is called on to move that impulse, your ship would then move. Shuttles and fighters then get to move. Then seeking weapons get to move. And then if any damage happens from movement, that is resolved. Then you go into the other steps of cloaking, uncloaking, tractor beams, launching seeking weapons. And then we have something here called ESG interactions. That's a specific weapon to a specific couple of races. Then you have shield operation steps. Then you have another weapon that's unique to one race called a shield cracker. It only damages shields. And they had that weapon firing before the transporter actions, because you actually fire that weapon to drop an opponent's shield to activate your transporters. So it's there in the sequence above transporter actions. And then you have something called emergency deceleration. So if you're moving along at a nice speed and you suddenly decide that you don't want to be moving anymore, you can declare that you're turning off your engines, kind of thing, and that slows you down to speed 0 after a couple of impulses of movement, coasting to a stop kind of thing. And then you have something called fighter dogfighting. So if you have two fighters on the map, they can engage in an intense maneuvering combat kind of thing if they're in the same hex. Then you have the landing of shuttles, launching of shuttles, and then you've got your firing of weapons. And then if you have a Tholian involved in the game, any web they've fired off or laid, it solidifies. So that's the full sequence of play chart. And it gets more complex as you add more races. If you are not using a race that has ESGs, then you just skip this step. If you're not using the Celtorians, you just skip this step. If you're not using fighters, you just skip that step. And if you're not using Tholians, you just skip that step. So it gets more complex as you add more races, kind of thing. But that is the complete sequence of play. And you can put this on the map as a chart, and you can click on them to actually echo the steps into the chat area. But you don't actually need to use that chart, because up here in this button you have the exact same sequence of play. Now we have something here called HET and TAC. Well, a high energy turn is basically when you want to turn your ship around in a very high energy maneuver and start going the other direction. So if I'm going in this direction and then all of a sudden I want to turn around and start going that direction, that's called an HET, or high energy turn. Now it's also used if you're performing maneuvering. So if I were to go forward, turn, let me turn my trail on. If my turn mode is 2, and I don't want to go forward and I don't want to side slip, but let's say I want to turn immediately. Well, if I immediately turn, I'm doing that outside of my turn mode, and this would be considered a high energy turn. So a high energy turn can be anything from just one turn when your turn mode's not completed to completely reversing the direction of your ship. Okay, so the thing we haven't talked about yet is the weapon arcs. So if we actually look at the weapons on this Federation ship, I have 2 photons, A and B, and it says photons are FA. I have 3 phaser 1s, 1 phaser 1 here, which is marked as FA. I got 1 phaser 1 over here, which is marked as LS, which is left side. And I have 1 phaser 1 over here, which is RS, which is right side. And then I have 2 phaser 3s down here, which are labeled as RH, which is rear half. Okay, well, there is a little diagram here. This little arrow in the center of the diagram is to represent your ship, and then these are the firing arcs around your ship. So I do have a little chart here that I'm going to drag out onto the board. So this is your firing arc diagram. So here, on this little diagram on the left, it shows an L. Well, here's a better representation of what L arc is. So if I were to grab this counter and put it down here, the L arc would be up this hex row, up that hex row, and everything in between, out to infinity. So that's what an L arc is. Now you have these arcs up here with photon FA. Well, if we look at the little chart, FA is left front plus right front. So we look at the chart over here, that is left front, that is right front. And we have the same thing here. So this yellow is right front, and this purple is left front. So the two of them together are your FA arc. So if I rotate my counter here on the map, that means my FA arc would be out this hex row, it would be out that hex row, and everything in between. And that would be the FA arc. So if my Klingon opponent is not in my FA arc, that means I would not be able to, or allowed to, fire my FA weapons. So right here in this positioning, this Klingon is just inside my FA arc, but if he were here, he is outside my FA arc, which means I would not be able to fire my photons at him. But he is inside left side. So left side is my left front, left, and left rear. So again, here on the chart, it's left front, left, and left rear. So basically the left side of the ship. So the Klingon is within the arc of my left side phaser 1. He is also outside of my FA phaser 1. And he is also outside the arc of my rear half phaser 3s. Now if I were to put my ship here, my phaser 3s do fire out here into this hex, but not this hex. So this hex, this hex, this hex, this hex. So the Klingon is within the arc of my rear half, which is from here all the way over to here. So what they've done is, sorry, I think I misspoke a moment ago. The rear half would fire into 1404, it would fire into 1303, it would fire into 1204, and into 1103. So basically any hex that is intersected by this weapon, this line of sight tool, is considered to be included in the rear half. So 1204, 1303, 1204, and 1103. So anything that this red line touches into can be fired into. So 1203 is outside of it, 1204 is inside of it, because it's a rear half. Now if it was a forward half weapon, then it would be able to fire into 1403, 1303, 1203, and 1103. So that's how your front half and your rear half weapons work. So those are what are called firing arcs. And there are several types of arcs. Put that on the map. So here this FX is a weapon arc that the Klingon have. The other part of that is rear arc. Farther down here, this FA, that's a typical photon arc. And then the space that is not comprised by the FA is considered to be called RX. And then you have your regular diagram. And then you have some other weapons which are slightly different, called plasmas, or plasma torpedoes, and they use portions, which can be a front portion, which is the same thing as the front half. And then you have something called the left portion and a right portion, and you even have something called an aft portion. And then you have some special Klingon weapons which have special arcs where they gain a little bit of extra. So, for instance, a Klingon ship has 3 phaser 1s right on the nose of the ship. They can fire directly behind the ship, plus out to the side a little bit. And they can fire out this side and just a little bit extra. So some weapons and some ships have some complex firing arcs. But for the most part, most ships have pretty simple firing arcs that are easy to understand. So the combination of the firing arc, the maneuvering, and the shield determination is the richness of this game. Your sequence of play tells you in what sequence order things are conducted, and your movement chart tells you on what impulses things move, and you reallocate your power every turn during energy allocation. So basically what you do is you fire your weapons at your opponent's ship, you damage the shield until the shield is gone, and then once the shield is gone, you then start doing internal damage. So how do you determine what is damaged inside the ship? Well, we actually have a damage allocation chart for that. And for the cadet game, this is what that chart looks like. So you roll a d6, so if you have 7 points of internal damage happening to a ship, you roll 7 dice, and then you call off the 7 items. So you could hit hull, engines, this group of systems at your choice, a weapon, or another group of systems. And then once all the hull are gone, if you were to roll another 1 instead of hitting a hull, it then would hit an engine. If all your engines are gone, you would then start hitting this choice of systems. And if all of those systems were gone, then you would start hitting weapons. And if all the weapons were gone, then you start hitting what's called excess damage. And then you have the same thing here for the full game. I'll just use the 50% chart. It might be a little easier to see. Actually, I'll go back to the full one and just recenter it. So this is the chart that's used for the big full-scale game, and you roll 2 d6 to determine what gets hit, and items that are underlined get hit once, and if you call another number on that, it doesn't hit it. So if I were to roll 3 3s, I would hit a drone, that the second 3 would hit a phaser, and then the third 3 would hit an impulse, and the fourth 3 would hit another impulse, and the fifth 3 would hit another impulse, until all the impulses are gone. But the systems that are underlined just get hit the once, and then you move on. So I may have 10 phasers on my ship, but my third roll of a 3 would not hit another phaser, it would hit an impulse, because phasers underlined, it hits once, and then it's done. Now there are items in here where you do hit any weapon. So for instance here for row L, if I were to roll 7, if I reach row L, it's any weapon. And yes, you would keep hitting any weapon until all weapons are gone. So this is how the damage occurs. Of course, this follows a standard distribution where you're going to roll more 6s, 7s, and 8s than you were going to roll 2s, 3s, 11s, and 12s. So the chart is kind of constructed to take that into effect on a standard distribution. Of course, you may roll nothing but 2s and 3s. You could just simply do that randomly, and your damage would occur according to that. But you follow this chart to determine what boxes on your ship are hit when you do damage. So it's taken me about 39 minutes to explain the entire game to you in a rapid manner. Now, one of the things that people complain about Starfleet Battles is they look at the size of the rulebook, and what they don't realize is that they're looking at not just one rulebook. They're actually looking at 15 different rulebooks that have been compiled into one big book, because Starfleet Battles is a modular game. You can just buy Basic Set and play with just the ships and the technology that is in Basic Set, and it's a complete game. You can buy something called Advanced Missions, which will add some more ships, a couple more races, and some more weapon technology, and a few more rules. And the Advanced and the Basic books together is the core of the entire game. But then you can add a whole slew of more things. For instance, fighters. The standard game generally doesn't have fighters, but you can add fighters. There's one specific race that is heavily into using fighters. But then there are other modules which introduce carriers, escorts, and various different numbers of fighters that you can add into the game. But if you don't like using fighters, you don't have to use those modules. So that's an entire section of that big rulebook that for you doesn't exist. You don't have to buy it. And then the other modules are basically racially specific modules. So if you buy module R whatever, you are going to get a collection of specific races. And if you never buy that module, you don't need to worry about the rules for those races' specific weapons, and your rulebook is smaller. There are some races that some people just never like to play. For instance, Andromedan have a completely different shielding system and power system. So their rules are much more math intensive, and a lot of people don't want to do that, so they never play Andromedan. So that section of rules is not in their rulebook. So it is a modular game. The rulebook can be as thin as you like or as complex as you like. So the core rules are the basic and advanced. There is a subset of rules called tournament, which has fewer rules than basic and advanced. And then there's the cadet game, which is even fewer rules than tournament or the basic and advanced. So if you want to play a real small, simple game, you can play cadet. If you want to use tournament rules, you can play tournament rules. If you want to play the full core set of rules, there's the basic and advanced. Now, even with basic and advanced, in that rulebook you have what are called commander's level rules, which are the rules that you always use. And then there are non-commander's level rules, which are basically just rules. But then you have advanced rules, and then you have optional rules. So commander's rules, regular rules, and advanced rules are the typical rule set that everybody's kind of agreed that they're going to be using. Optional rules are rules that you have to specifically agree to use. So if all you have is the basic set, all you have are commander's levels rules and basic rules. If you buy the advanced rulebook, then you get the advanced rules. But in both basic and the advanced rulebook, there are optional rules which you can try out for fun or never use. So there's your 47-minute quick and dirty way to play Starfleet Battles. So have fun playing Starfleet Battles.